Jay Cole.
Here.
Ahua Yang Hoffman.
Here.
James Hovland. James Hovland. Elizabeth Hout.
Jim Hovland here.
Elizabeth Hout. Doug Loon.
Hi, Doug Loon is here.
Mary Jo McGuire.
Here.
Hanai Sabjam.
I'm here.
George Schember.
Here.
Aline Cherma.
Here.
Tom Weaver.
I'm here.
Janet Williams.
Here.
Jerry Bell.
Here.
And Pat Bourne is here.
Okay, great, thank you. So I think we've got everybody. Before we move on to the business item, I see that Chair Zelli is here with us today. I don't know if there's anything that you would like to speak to the committee. Certainly we welcome your attendance. If you have anything that you'd like to.
No, thank you, Madam Chair. I'll just say how much I appreciate you and all the committee members for putting in the time. This is important work, and I know most of you, and I know that you're very familiar with the council, but I can attest that I have learned something every day since January, and this is really important work to consider the importance of our work. So thank you for putting the time, and I'm just tuning in to listen and learn as well. So I'll sign off. Thank you, Mary Liz.
All right, thank you. So just a couple of housekeeping items. The minutes from the last meeting have been posted to the website, but they were not distributed with your materials, nor were approval of the minutes included in the agenda as it was distributed. So what I'd like to do is just hold off to our next meeting, and we'll make sure that the minutes for both the first and second meetings are distributed and will be listed as a part of our agenda for the next meeting on October 12th. And then I just see if there's before we move on to our presentations today, I'm just ask if there's any questions or concerns by committee members before we start. All right, well then I think what we will do is we'll go right into the business section of our meeting, which we start with a presentation by Met Council on the Met Council role as an MPO. And we have Nick Thompson and Amy Benoit will be presenting this material. And as you are aware, a number of slides for the PowerPoints were distributed to the committee. We won't be looking at all of them as part of the presentation. So once again, you were sent homework as well to review. So with that, Nick, are you going to start?
Yes, Madam Chair. Again, Nick Thompson, I'm the Director of MTS Division at the Council, and with me today is Amy Benoit. She's Deputy Director of Planning and lead of our planning. She's here to help answer questions you may have about our MPO status. So I touched on this a little bit last week about the role of the MPO, but we're going to go just a little bit deeper into what the statutory requirements are, how our MPO is made up, what the role is envisioned as an MPO is governed by federal law, and then close with some of the steps that if there was a redesignation, what steps you would go through. So next slide, and the next slide. So the way to think about how we're governed as an MPO is both law and state law. It's required, the transportation planning work is required by both of these, and it's a little bit confusing because they have different requirements, especially for Minnesota, so they're not always in sync. The way to think about it is generally the state requirements are more focused about our transportation planning, and then how that relates to local governments. Whereas the federal requirements is designed since ICE-T in 1991 are really about planning and investment on the principal arterial and minor arterial highway network, and where we work with MnDOT and the counties and heavily with the cities related to that road network. Next slide. So MnDOT will be presenting after me about the MPOs within our state. It exists if you have a greater than 50,000 population. There are 400 MPOs in the nation, 8 of which are in Minnesota. The big distinction in Minnesota is between those that are urbanized with a population over 200,000, like the Met Council, and those that are between 50 and 200,000. And those over 200,000 receive federal funds directly and approve all federal fund spending in that MPO region. So that's a clear distinction between the 50,000 and greater and 200,000 and greater. The council and the MPO area we represent and is the only transportation management area in Minnesota. And we are the 17th largest MPO by population nationally. Next slide.
Nick, just real quick, for members, we're getting a lot of feedback. So if you're not speaking, if you would mute your mics, it might help with some of the feedback. And certainly if you have a question, you can speak up, because of course I can't see everybody with this view for the meeting, but if you're not speaking, to mute might help with the feedback. Thanks. Sorry,
Okay.
Nick.
All right. Next slide. So I mentioned we're the 17th largest. This is where we fall within the top 22 MPOs in the state. Some of our peer region information that we've presented to this group, and a lot of questions are kind of comes from this look of how our peers in our, Denver is similar to us, Seattle, San Diego are ones that we usually look at in terms of population. And this is the population based in the 2010 census. Next slide. The MPO area boundary is defined by federal law, is based on the census, and it can update every 10 years. We are required by federal statute to cover the urbanized area. And in this map, you see the blue area is the urbanized area as defined by federal law. And in 2010, that blue area expanded beyond the 7-county boundary area of the 7 counties of the Met Council to include a portion of the urbanized area in Sherburne and Wright County. And we anticipate this blue area, this urbanized area, will again change after the 2020 census is certified and official. But you can expand your boundaries beyond the urbanized area. And with the Met Council, we've obviously expanded the area of the Met Council to the 7-county region, plus the 2 blue areas for the MPO statute functions in Sherburne and Wright County. Next slide, please. So I mentioned this as the urbanized from the census. It's an area of the MPO jurisdiction for planning and programming of federal funds. So each MPO defines its boundaries. We've defined it larger than the urban area. That must at least include that urbanized area. And we must look at that urbanized area, what's going to be 20 years out, because that's where our planning horizon comes. Next slide, please. The backbone of the federal portion of the MPO is that 3C planning process, where it's cooperative, where it must include local governments, federal and state agencies who have oversight over transportation investment and land use, the transportation providers, be it MnDOT or the public transit providers, and obviously has a strong public input portion to that. It's a comprehensive in that it's all transportation modes. Federally, it's highway, transit, bicycle, pedestrian, and freight. Our state law for our region has also added airport planning as a council responsibility. That is not an MPO requirement, but when we combine our federal and state laws, we say that it's for all transportation modes. And most importantly, it must be continuing. Transportation planning is always looking ahead. We know things change. We must always be updating and ongoing and evolving as transportation behaviors and land uses change. must be evaluating our investments. So it's a continuous process that look ahead, cooperate with our local agencies, be comprehensive in what we look at. Next slide, please.
I had a question,
Sure.
or comment. It seems like there's emphasis on the transportation more by many of the constituents rather than, you know, the bicycle, transit, pedestrian. Is that, I think we need to do a better job perhaps of emphasizing that we need to look into the future, and that's, we're kind of stuck on the transportation part, the highways. Do you think that's prevalent or not?
And committee member, I think we are, in the next month and a half, we'll be adopting our next 2040 transportation policy plan. And within that plan, it looks very deeply at each mode.
Okay.
But I think on something like maybe pedestrian or bicycle, it's always been a little bit more local focused for pedestrian safety. Our region in the past 10 years has really taken a strong look at like creating a regional bicycle network.
Right.
And that I think has shifted, at least in the bicycle mode, to a more regional thinking, and counties and cities have really responded to building a network beyond just their own community, whereas pedestrian probably remains a little bit more local, but we do try to think about the regional issues around each of those modes, be it maybe safety, design, land use that improves safety for pedestrians or bicycles. So I think in our policy plan, we have a pretty strong modal breakdown for each mode. Now, a lot of the funding itself goes to roadways and for transit, and a much smaller portion for bicycle or pedestrian improvements. So many of our roadway investments now and transit investments have very strong bike and pedestrian elements, whereas maybe 10, 15 years ago, you did not see that. So I think our region has really become much more stronger in those other modes in the past decade.
I had another question that had to do with when those areas in Sherburne and Wright County were becoming part of our MPO, why would they not go to St. Cloud or one of the other areas?
That, Madam Chair, committee member, that gets strictly back to that federal law that defines a continuous urbanized area by the census. And so they were connected by land use to our urbanized area. They do continue to do a lot of their planning, though, within MnDOT's district that is headquartered in St. Cloud. So a lot of their planning also works with the St. Cloud region. And so they're kind of working with both our MPO area and the broader area around that includes the St. Cloud district. They're kind of straddling both for planning efforts and investment. Any other questions? All right, I'll continue here. So as defined, what the core responsibilities are is really why MPO exists. It's really to recognize that transportation is a regional system. It needs a lot of different decision makers to make the best, most efficient, strongest long-term investments. So really defining the MPO is really about working together, and then using the federal funding process as kind of both the requirement and the decision making around you must have a plan, you must approve the federal investments, you must approve the TIP or the Transportation Improvement Program, which includes all federal funds every year to this MPO body. You must monitor how your investments are doing through performance targets. You must present information about how it's doing. And that performance monitoring is really to verify that your planning efforts are strong and that your plan, maybe you need to make some changes if your performance isn't there. It's also very strongly that the public needs to be the one that really provides the input on where your investments go at the regional level, not just at a local level. And so it provides that public input into regional investments. There are requirements around air quality maintenance and modeling of air quality, especially air quality was a much bigger issue in years past. We've done a lot in our region to reduce the negative impacts of air quality through investments. Air quality is improved, but we must maintain that air quality, and we have MPO is responsible for monitoring that. And then there's large and small MPOs, and we are in the large category. And there's a requirement around a congestion management process that we as the MPO, must administer, and that is a regional planning process also. So next slide. So it's all about partnerships. Our regional partners are, as you know, we have the council as the MPO, but also we have our transportation committee of the council that takes items up and passes actions. The transportation committee meets every 2 weeks. They're meeting tonight. We have the TAB, Transportation Advisory Board, and its technical committees. MnDOT, counties, cities, townships are all investors in transportation systems. Our tribal governments, both in our region and for some investments, are of the 11 recognized tribes in the state have we see as key partners in our transportation system in the region. Our federal agencies that provide services that overlap with transportation, be it DNR, pollution control, or public safety. Our transit providers, Metro Transit, who's operated by the council, which is sort of unique to have the transit operator and the MPO in the same body. And then we have our suburban transit providers in the region, the University of Minnesota. Because the state law said that airport planning is part of the MPO in our state, our MAC is a key partner, of course, public participation. Next slide, please. I'll go a little deeper on our Transportation Advisory Board because they are a key part of our transportation planning part in our region. They are established by state law, the membership. It is 34 members. Each of the counties has a member, 7 counties has a member, 10, and the 7 county members are county commissioners that are appointed by each of the county boards. They're not appointed by the council. We have 10 elected city officials that are appointed through Metro Cities process. And then we have 1 elected official who represents the suburban transit providers. We have our 4 agencies that are listed there, and the council being also covering the transit representative. The council appoints 8 citizen representatives who are geographically presented. So 1 citizen representative overlaps with 2 council districts so that they're geographically representing the region. And those are through an application process and appointment by the council. Then the modal representatives for freight, 2 for transit, and modal representatives for bike and pedestrian. So the local elected officials are the majority of the TAB board, and the TAB is responsible for approving federally funded projects through the regional solicitation. Right this fall, the TAB will be recommending projects for nearly $200 million in federal funding. They also approve annually the TIP. What TAB recommends for approval in federal funding, council either then concurs with the recommendation or asks for reevaluation and denies the program. That is a cooperative process that, looking back, that has occurred extremely rarely, if just maybe 1 or 2 times where the council has denied the TAB recommendation on federal funding. And even in those instances, they came to a consensus on a solution for the federal funding. And then TAB has a very strong input into our transportation planning projects. They comment and review, the technical committees especially, really influence the transportation planning and investment strategies for our region. Next slide, please. The structure of our TAB, so TAB is below the council in this organization. This represents what the MPO is also. MnDOT has the Metro District Engineer as its representative on TAB. MnDOT also designates the freight rep for the region as to be a member of the TAB. There is a TAB coordinator who serves at the pleasure of the TAB to kind of coordinate all the activities of TAB and the technical committees. There's an executive committee of TAB and of the TAC, and then the technical committees. Next slide, please. The technical committees are made up of staff of the counties, cities, the transportation agencies in the region, and this is where staff that represent the Wright and Sherburne area are represented on the committee. They have 1 member that they choose from their area to participate in TAC at the technical level and provide input into our planning process. We have a memorable understanding with those committees about that process. These are all technical staff, be they engineers or planners, that really help shape the technical details and evaluation of projects in the regional solicitation. They provide a lot of technical recommendation to TAB about projects and any changes to projects that TAB may have funded through the regional solicitation. And they provide very strong technical input in shaping the multimodal planning studies and products and policy plans that are adopted in our region. Next slide, please. So a question often comes up about the designation of whether Met Council really is the MPO for the region. I thought it'd be good to kind of go through a little bit of history that reinforces that. So the council was designated in 1973 by Governor Wendell Anderson as the MPO. It's in 1991 that the really major federal law change under the ICE Act that raises the question about the status of the council. That 1991 federal ICE Act defined what a MPO membership must represent and who is on that. And that federal requirements is different than what our MPO structure is in our region. However, in 1991, they also grandfathered in any MPOs that existed at that time, and their structure was grandfathered in. And so that's why the Met Council continues to be, in our cooperation with TAB, continues to be properly designated MPO for the region. The status of the council as the MPO has been questioned several times in the past decade, and the US DOT on 4 separate occasions has issued a ruling that affirmed that the structure we have with TAB and the council is compliant with federal law and designation as the MPO. The most recent time they have reaffirmed this status was in August of 2018. And I think that information has been provided to committee members, some of those letters. We also go through a federal certification review that looks at the MPO status and verifies that we're still in compliance with federal law. That occurs every 4 years now. And our last review confirmed in 2016 are certified us as the MPO in the structure that our region has. And we have another federal review that will occur this December. And I'm not anticipating any changes because there's been no legislative change that would question past US DOT determinations. Next slide. So last slide here is really that if there's recommendations that would change the structure of the MPO, there is a process that must be followed in terms of how you go about redesignating a new MPO. This redesignation process has been used in other regions, so it is pretty standard process. For our region, it would be, there has to be an agreement by the governor, and then the units of government in that region, that general purpose government, so that represent at least 75% of the urbanized area population. And that also must have approval from the largest incorporated city based on population within that area. So in our region would also include Minneapolis. And it would be looking at whatever the most current census is, be it 2010 to get, or if the redesignation occurred after the 2020 census. So it must be approval through action by 75 governments that represent 75% of the population of that area. So a significant amount of the governments, and then also the largest city and the governor. And then if there's a redesignation, then it must comply with that 1991 membership requirements. So it would include local elected officials, then officials from the public agencies, or MnDOT, and the transit provider would be the council, and other state agencies. And so this is just kind of concluding with, it's been affirmed that the MPO status meets federal law. But if there is a desire to change that status, there's a very defined process about how that status change can be approved. And then once it's approved, it must be compliant with the membership as designated by the federal law since 1990. So that concludes the parts of the presentation that we were going to go through, and we could take additional questions.
All right. Thank you, Nick. So Amy's just standing by for
Yep.
questions. She doesn't have an official presentation.
That is correct.
Okay, great. Thank you. So let's stop here after this presentation and see if there's any questions. I think, Jerry, did you have a question?
Yes, Nick. So Met Council was grandfathered in with the MPO status. Can you explain a bit about what are the key differences? Yeah.
Yes. So the Madam Chair and committee member. So the key difference is around the elected officials. So the council, as the MPO, has appointed council members appointed by the governor, and so the MPO, as defined by 1991, really defines that the elected official role. And so that is the big difference between is the appointed officials of council members versus designated elected officials. There are different ways to include elected officials. They could be directly elected to a council, or they could be from member governments that are serving a role. And so there's different ways to meet that elected official law.
I just have a comment.
Certainly, Mayor Williams.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say that often we say that they're appointed by the governor, but we don't really talk about the process that's gone through for those appointments. That there's a nominating committee that's appointed that goes through all the applications, and the nominating committee is made up of elected officials who make the recommendation to the governor. And that seems to be a little portion that seems to be not always brought up.
Thank you for that. Any other questions?
Quick question here. So we followed the federal funding of roads and transit. Are there other laws, say in waste treatment, et cetera, that apply to the MPO, or is it mainly the transit that we're following here?
Madam Chair, members, it's the MPO is around the transportation and land use, but the other functions of the council, of course, has many other functions than those of the MPO, as we mentioned, our wastewater, parks, some housing that we mentioned last week in our divisions, and those are not part of the MPO designation. The MPO is just a portion of what the council does. But in some of the other regions, the MPO just does the MPO functions. And so there's different models in different regions.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I think Tom Weaver, I think, is next. Tom?
Thanks, Madam Chair. Nick, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I think I might. Can you just tell us, is this current structure working or are there problems with it? Is it run efficiently? Is it effective? Are we accessing the federal funds that we need to access, or are there parts of the region that feel left out or projects that aren't getting done? Can you just kind of comment on that?
Good luck, Nick.
So let me see how I should answer that one.
The question is, are you wearing your tap shoes?
Right. I think we have I get the opportunity to see how regional governments work in our peers. And I think we have a really strong regional transportation planning process where TAB, I think, is a body advising the council, is a very strong plan. There is, that's a group of 34 that comes with a wide variety of input and opinions, but reaches an agreement about regional decisions that in today's politics and world is really, I think, unique. I think it's unique that we have transit operations within the council, but I think that's actually an asset of the council. The regions that have transit separate from their MPO don't have as good a strong a planning process, I don't think. It also makes the planning process consider operations in a way that's important. We do pretty well in terms of getting federal funding, but there's never enough money for transportation. And so we are competing, but we're building a pretty good network of, we have really good performance measures for congestion, for highways. Our pavements and bridges are much better than some regions. It could always use more. We won Transit System of the Year a couple years ago. Our bicycle network, we are top 1 or 2. Our airport is, I don't know, I think I'm biased, but I think it's the best airport in the US. And so if you look at our transportation systems, we have really good systems, and I think our planning process has led to that. So I'd have to say it's working pretty well. But I also work for the MPO, so others might have different opinions.
Thanks, Nick.
All right, who else?
I just had a question. Oh,
Mary Jo, and then Jim.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Good job, Nick. You brought your tap shoes. That was great. No, you did a great job. I'm just in full disclosure, I'm lucky to serve on TAB as the Ramsey County rep and under the great leadership of Jim Hovland, who chairs our TAB. And I do think, as Nick said, that I'm amazed myself at how we can come together on all of us on that board. I wanted you to go into a little more detail, Nick, about what happens to transit if it's not run by the MPO. I can't even imagine that it would be a very functioning transit system if it wasn't run by the planning organization. So you said it's unique. How unique, and what else would they do? Just run by themselves?
Madam Chair, committee member, it is. Generally, they often have another transit governing board.
Wow.
Is common, and then that board must work with the MPO function and be represented on it. Sometimes that works okay, and in some places it doesn't work well. But you think about, we have the MnDOT operating separate, but they're a member of the MPO, and so it's something that can work. But often there has to be another governance structure for transit. Or there often is in the regions where the transit is separate from the MPO. So I would expect that would be maybe an outcome of that separation of that. We have our suburban providers in our region. They have their own boards or governance structures for their individual operations. So it's probably something like that. And our region in the past has had a separate transit board in our region, and it was merged into the council probably because of its things that weren't working as well back then. So we've had a history of that here in our region too.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Since Tom was the regional administrator, and maybe during the time he was the regional administrator, we had the constant reevaluation of the regional solicitation and this quest to improve the regional solicitation, look at how we were doing scoring. And it becomes a more and more refined product over time. And with these 34 people on the MPO that have a variety of views of the world, we've been really successful in kind of managing these different tranches and different options on the way we can allocate those federal funds. And then the last thing we do is we put a geographic balance lens over everything, and then try to come up with a hybrid of the way we're going to spend those funds that come down to the region in that next solicitation. And 2 solicitations ago, when we did it for the first time with that geographic balance overlay, and Mary Jo was there at the time, and others may have been as well. The tab all stood up and gave itself a standing ovation. So it was really quite remarkable, and it's been a really good working group. To answer your question succinctly, I'd say, yeah, it's been highly effective in the work that it's been doing for the region, that it's been doing it in a fair way.
All right, Eileen.
Thanks. Nick, I just have one quick question for you. I think it was helpful when you started to describe, hopefully, can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, when you were describing earlier about the different functions of the council, the MPO, how many people do you have supporting the MPO from a staff perspective, and how does that compare to the overall staff complement of the council?
That's a great question, Madam Chair. Eileen, we have about 25 in our planning group, which I would say is really the staff of the MPO in that function. But then there are some others in like research and work that have duties like in Metro Transit that are definitely supporting the MPO and planning processes. You know, the council itself has over 4,500 employees with transit and wastewater. So it's the MPO part of the council staff-wise is maybe 25 full-time equivalent in the planning function.
All right, any other questions? Pat, welcome.
Hi, thank you. Nick, I have two questions. Looking at the list of who needs to sign off on a redesignation, should this group make any recommendations about changes to the MPO? One group that I can't quite get my head around is the providers of transportation. Can you give us at least a partial list of who that might include?
I think I'm going to defer to Amy on this one just to make sure let's get the complete answer. Amy, if you have, but that would for sure be MnDOT, the transit provider.
The transit provider, each region gets to select essentially who they want to represent transit providers. In our region, you would only need one representative. So given that we have Metro Transit and then the suburban transit providers, we would have to essentially select, well, we could select both of them, or we could select between them. But the requirement is just that you have one representative of transit.
Okay, thank you. My second question is, if the MPO is redesignated and we redesignate the MPO to be something different, we also have to deal with the planning organization in the state law, because the state law designates a planning structure too. So if we were going to suggest a redesignation of the MPO, we might also have to suggest changes to this planning structure too, because right now it seems to me like it's pretty closely affiliated and closely coordinated. And we might not want to have two separate organizations, one under federal law and one under state law. Am I thinking about that right, Nick, or is it not as complicated as I'm imagining it might be?
Chair, member, I would say that you're thinking about that correctly. We've, in our state, have added on to the federal and really integrated some state requirements that are ingrained together in their process. That redesignation that you see, that is really about what's at least required for federal. So you would have to meet that, but we have state statutes on our planning too. And I think you'd want to, they are definitely integrated, and you want to think about those together so that you don't create more problems by just meeting.
Yeah, my conclusion would be this is some very large Jenga-like structure that we have here. And pulling one thing out to create something in response to a need might be a delicate piece of maneuvering. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Okay, let's, Connie.
Yes, quickly, I wanted to add on to Tom Weaver's loaded question there. I was his counterpart back then at MnDOT. I think it worked real well back then when we were there, Tom. but a lot of the people on this call were there. But I think it's a product of, maybe I would have answered it this way if I was sitting in Nick's spot, that Duke, and I think he mentioned it because of the limited funding, constrained funding, you always need to pick and choose based on some process, and that's defendable. And whenever you pick projects for every one person you make happy, you may disappoint 4 or 5 people. So, you know, I think bottom line, it becomes, some of it has to do with that. But I think overall, I think the system works, whether it stays this way or it's changed in the future. I think Minnesota has a great reputation nationally, doing great work in planning. So.
Thank you. Any other questions? So Nick, I've got just a couple. So if in fact your 25 people, are they funded by federal funds? So talk a little bit about if you were to take the MPO function and say move them to MnDOT like the rest of the state, how would the funding work on that? And would we be moving 25 people to the MnDOT headquarters, or how would that all work?
Madam Chair, yeah, we receive federal planning dollars that help pay for the 80% of the staff time that are dedicated to the planning, transportation planning function. Then we provide local match to that federal funds with motor vehicle sales tax in our region. And so at some point, the federal funding can be flexible to where the MPO is, where the MPO function is, but it does need that local match to support the federal funding. It depends on what the eventual structure was, but there's some flexibility of where that funding would go, is the best I could probably say. But it does, we have to determine how you're going to match the federal with local dollars. We have a structure in place today. If it changes to a different organization, that would have to be how that local match would come. If that answers your question.
It helps.
Nick,
Yep, go ahead, Amy.
Chair Holberg, can I jump in quick here?
Of course.
We can get you some information on how other MPOs across the nation do it, but I think there's actually a rule that prohibits the MPO from being part of the DOT. So the other options are freestanding MPO. Some MPOs are within a county, a few are within the city. I think MnDOT will talk a little bit about how the greater Minnesota MPOs are structured, but putting it within the DOT, I believe, is prohibited.
Okay. Well, that might be a good segue, but I see Mayor Couts has her hand up. So Mayor Couts.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So first of all, I want to find out what is it that we're trying to solve with regard to the system that we have now. And if we move the transit function to the DOT, and I hear that Amy says that we can't do that, which is because then what happens to the opt-out? Do they fall outside of that realm? I mean, then where does that governance, does it move over to the DOT? So I think for me, it's what's the problem we're trying to solve? Is this not working, and how isn't it working? And what is it that we want to do? We've gone through a lot of these discussions, and I remember the first time I've sat through all of this was under Governor Arne Carlson. And then just recently through the Citizens League with Pahua and others, and many others who are on this team. So I'm trying to get my arms around what is it that we're trying to solve here.
Well, I think it's early in the process, but you're right. I mean, for decades, many of us have participated in a variety of working groups in different roles. I mean, as we heard from Deb Dyson last week, it's a perennial issue at the legislature about the structure and how it operates. And so we've been tasked by the governor to look at it again. And so I can't predict for you where this is going to end up. But I mean, with certainly all respect to Tom Weaver, and I mean, I don't think that everybody's happy currently. We wouldn't be here if everybody was happy. I think that this over the decades, the council may, I don't know if lurch is too big of a word, but certainly veers, with different goals, different strategies, different priorities. And depending on which side of the issues you are, you may be happy or not. The whole governance issue, I mean, I don't think there's any region that has a similar transit scenario where you have so many operators within one area. A frequent thing is the people with the money. I think, we've heard recently with the role of Met Council as both a funder and an operator, whether or not that's a conflict in distributing how monies are distributed, et cetera. So, I mean, I think there's a variety of issues, large and small. And, we'll just have to be patient and work through this and get input, and then make recommendations, whatever they are. To the degree that we can develop consensus, great. It may end up being a menu of options. I mean, I can't predict at this point. So, Judd, did you want to add anything, or?
Yes. Thank you. All right. Hopefully there's not a bunch of feedback there, but what the governor had asked for this committee to do is, I don't necessarily think that they have to make a determination related to what to do with the MPO, but he wanted this committee to review the council's role as the MPO and identify and evaluate the ways that this designation complements and then conflicts with other council responsibilities under our state law. And that was touched on briefly by Nick. And I know that when we did our presentation 2 weeks ago, it was just to kind of talk about where the council as an appointed body is different as an MPO than other MPOs are across the country. But part of that is because of the different statutory responsibilities that we have in law. And it's for this committee to look at that and determine, well, it makes sense for these reasons, or it doesn't make sense for these reasons. And we were trying to flesh out a little bit through Nick's presentation to talk about, well, if a change were to be made, these are the steps that you have to go through regarding redesignation, which is very complicated in its own, approach. So there's not a problem necessarily to be solved unless folks think that, by looking at the way that this MPO designation works, isn't working well, and that we should take a different approach. So I think Mayor Cowitz raised a good point, and I don't, maybe it's up to this committee to decide, and for all I know, people may think that this is the best approach, or, upon further review, we may need to look at it a little bit further, but there isn't an expectation that this group makes a recommendation one way or the other. It's to review the MPO function and where it complements and where it could potentially conflict, and then it could just land right there and be done.
All right. Anything else? And otherwise we'll move on to the MnDOT presentation. And I see that Tim is here, so welcome.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you about the 7-county metropolitan area organizations. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm doing a sound check here at the same time to make sure that this is working for you. And so I'm hopeful that you can see the screen. Can everybody see that?
Yep, I think we're good.
Thanks. Thanks for this opportunity. These Greater Minnesota MPO partners are really important to us in terms of state, regional, and local transportation planning. My presentation, like Nick's, is going to provide you just a really brief overview of Greater Minnesota and their organizational structures, as well as the authority that we have in Greater Minnesota. So 7 Greater Minnesota MPOs lead the transportation planning process in those urbanized areas that have a population greater than 50,000. I think Nick talked to this already in his presentation, but I'll repeat a few things. Sorry for the duplication. In Greater Minnesota, these MPOs have the authority and the responsibility for transportation policy making within those MPO areas. The authority is based on federal legislation passed in the 60s that requires that any urbanized area with a population greater than 50,000 have an MPO. The MPOs ensure that the existing and future expenditures for transportation projects and programs in their areas are based on the 3C planning process. Those MPOs also cooperate with state and public transportation operators to set spending levels for federal funds that are meant for transportation projects. That cooperation includes those areas listed here, including the development of the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, the development of the Transportation Improvement Program, as well as the maintenance of the annual planning program, or the UPWP. When comparing the MPO area to the Greater Minnesota MPOs, it's really important to note an important difference. That difference is the extra responsibilities that MPOs designated as TMAs have, including the maintenance of the congestion management process, receiving those direct appropriations of federal funds, and that requirement that the composition of the board include the representatives of those public agencies that administer or operate major modes of transportation, including providers of public transportation. Based on current federal law and the urban population criteria, currently the Twin Cities MPO is the only TMA in the state of Minnesota. We expect, however, that Minnesota will add a TMA after the 2020 census, and that addition is likely to be the Fargo-Moorhead COG. The urbanized areas are updated based on the decennial census data, and an MPO can only change from that small urban MPO designation. That's where you have 50,000 to less than 200,000 population, to the TMA designation over 200,000 population after that decennial census, and vice versa. And it's really important that I note here that I'm stating the facts about the threshold for TMA's status and not making any suggestion or recommendation regarding the TMA status in the future. That list of Greater Minnesota MPOs includes the population for each Greater Minnesota MPO and projects a population greater than 200,000, and is why I expect that the Fargo-Moorhead Metropolitan Council will likely need to be designated as an MPO after the decennial census. Those population estimates come from the MPOs themselves, so they are strictly an estimate, and we'll have to wait to see what the actual outcome of the census is. This list also provides information on the type of organization and the location of each Greater Minnesota MPO. I've included that information because it's important to note that the Greater Minnesota MPOs are found within agencies such as regional planning organizations, area planning organizations, or these things called COGS, councils of governments. The responsibilities of those organizations are very wide-ranging, but in all cases are determined by its member jurisdiction and or their agencies. And in addition, you'll note that 4 of the Greater Minnesota MPOs are by state. The by state's lead in this arrangement is determined by the member jurisdictions and agencies again, with populations, I believe, being a significant factor. As you'd expect, these organizations and location require additional coordination, but that coordination doesn't change the role of the MPO. All of the Greater Minnesota MPOs have elected officials that are on their boards, and some include the representatives of public agencies, some major modes of transportation, including providers of public transportation and citizens, and in some cases, representatives of specific interests. An example that I can call out is the Rochester Olmsted Council of Governments, which has a Rochester School District seat on the ROCOG board. All members are either appointed by their jurisdiction or on the board by virtue of the position. For example, the mayor of a certain city may be on a specific board. And for all of these organizations, not unlike the MPO of the Twin Cities, they are made up of other technical committees that are made up of professional staff from the cities, from the counties, state, transit, other organizations that help to advise those committees as they do their work. So, consistent with federal law, the Greater Minnesota MPOs currently operate with MnDOT, transit operators, and local government to select projects. And they have the authority to coordinate project selection within their planning boundaries. That coordination role ensures that the projects within the MPO planning boundary are included in their TIP and consistent with their Metropolitan Transportation Plan. Of note also here is that in Greater Minnesota, they also participate in what's called an Area Transportation Partnership. This is a Minnesota-specific structure that was created back with Ice-T in the early 1990s. Metropolitan Council is the only MPO to almost entirely cover the same geography as the ATP and MnDOT district boundaries here in the Twin Cities. It's also important to note that if, in fact, the Fargo-Moorhead COG becomes a TMA, they will start receiving direct appropriations, similar to the direct appropriations that Nick talked about for the Twin Cities MPO, and then we'll have the authority to select projects for those funds. From Minnesota, they will receive, we estimate, around $1 million per year to start, and approximately $12 million per year by our rough estimates from North Dakota, as that is a bi-state MPO. Madam Chair, members, that concludes my very brief remarks on the structure and authority of Greater Minnesota MPOs, and I'd stand for any questions that you or members might have.
Eileen, you want to start? And I think we can maybe get the screen back to so we can see everybody again, but I can see you, so go ahead and start.
Thanks, Tim. I appreciate the presentation. You know, your comments about the bi-state MPOs reminded me about, you know, if the Fargo-Moorhead area were to become that, for its different designation, if that would require also the governor's approval in North Dakota, and similarly, if we went for designation in our area, I think Nick noted that our MPO goes into Wisconsin. Would we also need to consult with the governor of Wisconsin or state officials in Wisconsin? That's the first question. And then the second question is just the MPOs around the state, do they also have additional functions under them besides the transportation components?
Madam Chair, I can take the first question.
I'm wondering if somebody can change the screen, so instead of seeing Tim's screen, we could see everybody's faces. It makes it a little bit better. And again, if you're not speaking, if you turn off your mic, we'll get less feedback that way. So, okay, go ahead.
So for the first question about whether we would need Governor of Wisconsin's approval, our urbanized area currently goes into Wisconsin in downtown Stillwater as you went. That was tied to the lift bridge crossing. We are currently thinking that after the 2020 census that our urbanized area will no longer go into Wisconsin, so then would not need Wisconsin governor. The lift bridge was changed over to a bike and ped crossing, so we're just not sure. We don't think that that would no longer qualify as an urbanized area on the Wisconsin side of Stillwater. But we won't know for sure until after the 2020 census. As of today, we would need governor of Wisconsin because that small piece of Wisconsin is part of our MPO.
Madam Chair and members, Aileen, can you repeat the first part of your question? You were cutting out on me a bit.
Oh, sure. Sorry, I realize I don't have the best audio, but my question was, Tim, you talked about the structure of the MPOs in Greater Minnesota and the membership on their boards. Can you also talk about the functions? Do they have other responsibilities in addition to transportation planning?
Madam Chair, Member Chermoff, the short answer is yes. The members of their MPOs come from all aspects of transportation. Representatives come from the elected officials of counties and cities, but also are made up of membership from the transit organizations, as well as I said in my testimony, some of the other citizen representatives or special interests, which could include school boards and others.
I apologize. Maybe I'm not asking my question clearly. Is it do the MPOs themselves have additional functions or responsibilities? I'm trying to go closer to my mic while still staying on the screen. And people talk about the Met Council as the MPO also having, you know, wastewater, housing, other things. There's like Dr. Cog in Denver has aging and traffic signals. Each kind of has a different mix of responsibilities. Is that the same in Greater Minnesota? What are the responsibilities in general?
Madam Chair, Member Chermoff, the MPOs have responsibility for transportation in Greater Minnesota. And so only the COGs themselves are made up of interests that go beyond transportation. The MPO responsibilities are specific to transportation.
So maybe, can I clarify that just a little bit? So we knowing that federal funds are only a small portion of the transportation dollars. So are these area planning, the 8 regions of MnDOT, so they work with these, whether it's a council of governments or MPO or whatever, on that federal funding piece, but the real driver of the planning from a transportation perspective is more in the area planning as opposed to the individual urban areas. Is that a fair statement, or?
Madam Chair, to try to clarify, the ATPs are like the COGS and area transportation partnerships in Greater Minnesota. They're made up of representatives from across the region, but the ATPs have a focus on transportation. MPOs in those area organizations have a responsibility only for the transportation element, even though in all cases they are members of a broader organization that has responsibilities that go well beyond transportation.
But to flip it, as far as the transportation dollars, they're more focused on the federal dollars as opposed to all dollars.
Madam Chair, that is correct.
So only a small subset of the funding is distributed through these organizations.
Madam Chair, that is correct. And the ATPs in Greater Minnesota are focused on the federal funding.
All right. Okay, we got lots of hands up. I'm not sure who's next, so let's go with Connie. You're on the top of my screen.
Yeah, my question has to do with it. I think maybe for both Tim and Nick, maybe the Fargo-Moorhead, you think they would become one and TMA, I guess, because your predictions of what could happen with the census? Is that right? The population is going to grow?
Madam Chair, Chair Shabdin, yes. Okay. I do expect that based upon the population estimate, but we'll have to wait and see with the census.
So with regard to the census question, maybe this is for Nick or Tim or Amy, with the Wright County and Sherburne County populations changing, is the change going to be based on some homework that I've studied? Sounds like if the changes are big enough, the redesignation is required. So is it possible that you need to redesignate based on what happens could happen in Wright County or Sherburne County, the population?
Chair and member, we've looked at the growth since 2010, and we don't expect that there'll be that much change in the urbanized area. There'll be some expansion, but nothing that has changed in the population would itself trigger a redesignation that we believe for that Sherburne Wright area.
Sorry, Jerry, you want to go next?
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. My question is about those Greater Minnesota MPOs. I understand right now they don't receive federal funding directly. They don't make project selection directly. Are they getting those money as pass-through from Met Council right now or from ATP or other ways?
Madam Chair and Member Zhao, the funding is the responsibility of the state in Greater Minnesota. The MPOs participate by developing their TIPs. As far as the source of funding, it's through the state to the ATPs in the form of federal funding. And so it is the ATPs that have the ultimate responsibility for making the decisions about those federal funds in Greater Minnesota, with the MPOs really coordinating the work to develop their own TIPs and entering those TIPs into the AT process, and then eventually becoming a part of the state transportation investment plan.
Got it. Thank you.
And so then can you talk a little bit about transit, federal transit money? Is that also, and the state transit money, how does that work in contrast to how it works in the metropolitan area?
Madam Chair, in Greater Minnesota, transit funds are administered by the state, and so they are distributed through central office here in the Twin Cities to the transit operators in Greater Minnesota. Transit operators are not part of the MPO structure. They don't sit on the board as voting members, to my knowledge, but they do participate in the ATP process. And so there is coordination in Greater Minnesota when it comes to transit programs as a part of the TIP development process.
And is that true for both state and federal transit funding?
That is correct.
Okay.
And Madam Chair, in the metro area, the council receives the federal transit funding, with the exception of the rural portion of the 7 counties. We receive some federal money from MnDOT Transit for the rural portion for operating, but the overwhelming majority comes directly to the council as the transit operator.
And then just to throw one more thing on the table. So the transit funding for Health and Human Services for disability or seniors or medical appointments, how is that different from Greater Minnesota to the metropolitan area?
Madam Chair, I'm sure Nick can help with this, but there are other agencies that have responsibility for administering funds that are provided for certain needs in Greater Minnesota. Department of Health and Department of Human Services. Some of the transit operating dollars that you're talking about come through those agencies and come through legislative appropriations to serve those needs in Greater Minnesota. The state certainly coordinates with those activities to the extent that we can to ensure that there's not overlap in those investments where there might be a funding source from the state that can serve similar needs, but those needs are generally funded by other agencies.
So is there any role that MnDOT plays similar to the Metro Mobility function within the metropolitan area? Does MnDOT play any role whatsoever on Metro Mobility like transportation infrastructure in Greater Minnesota?
Madam Chair, there are services that have a look and feel to those types of services in Greater Minnesota. Some of those come currently through special grants, but I believe some of those services can also be provided through the 5307 transit program that would serve some of those specific needs. And as of late, we've had some special grants provided through the governor's actions to provide some appropriations that help us with some of the COVID-related needs that fit into that category as well, like being able to move those that are sick or presumptive sick that couldn't be moved by traditional transit services.
All right. Thank you for that. Any other questions, comments? Well, we might get done a little early today. So going once, going twice, going 3 times. All right, so I'll provide a little bit of a roadmap for our next 2 meetings. As I stated when we started, we'll have some minutes to approve. At our next meeting on the 12th, we will be hearing from the Legislative Auditor's Office on a governance report that they did, and also a history of transit, the opt-outs, kind of getting to some of the things that Mayor Couts was asking about earlier. That will occur at the meeting on October 12th. And then the following meeting on October 26th, we're hoping to hear from, in general terms, interested parties. And so we've been contacted by the League of Women Voters, Metro Cities. We'll probably look at some of the work that the suburban counties did around governance, and any kind of all-comers that would like to present, whether they have plans, policy statements, etc., so that we can look forward to that on the 26th. And we'll be reaching out to organizations that we know have an interest so that we can kind of use our time wisely and determine ahead of time how many people want to present and how much time we'll be able to give to each organization. So if you've been contacted by a group that wants to participate, make sure they make contact with us so we're aware of their interest. Any other questions? Commissioner McGuire.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm sorry if this was already touched on, but so we're focusing on transportation this meeting, of course. Are we going to be looking at in future meetings, the economic development role of Met Council or housing or any of those other areas? Do you see that in more meetings, or are we mainly going to be looking at the role in transportation?
Well, I guess to some degree it'll be driven by what the committee wants to look at. I mean, we've been trying to provide information, homework opportunities, and input. And then after our fourth meeting, we have 3 to 4 meeting times penciled in. And to the degree that this group wants to look at other things, I think, we'll take input and see. But certainly our role and our job is to be complete with a recommendation or some type of result to the governor by the end of the year. So hopefully after next week's meeting, we'll be able to get input from committee members if there are additional issues or presentations that people would like to consider prior to begin making some recommendations. So we're open to that idea, but we look for some consensus as a group as to how deep into the rabbit hole we're going to go.
Thank you.
My words. So, Connie.
Yeah, I was wondering if it's possible to summarize. I mean, there's a lot of documents out there, letters over the past few years that's gone back and forth to. And Judd sent us a few of them from FTA and FHWA, different positions, and then the letters that went out from this side to, making a case for a change. And is there a way to summarize it in like what the question was and what the answer and kind of the pros and cons as like a historic, simple historic, rich positions that we've seen, or is that too much work? Yeah, I've glanced through some of them, and I think we can figure it out. I'm curious what the different positions have been.
And are you requesting that positions of the federal government versus Met Council versus state agencies, or what? Is there a defined set of actors that you would want to provide a review of?
Well, there's different entities that have asked for for changes. From I see attorneys and that are representing certain agencies and so on. If it's a lot of work, don't worry about it, because there's been a lot of it. I'm just curious as we go forward. I assume at some point we would. I know Judd mentioned that our job is as a group to review the governance, but I would think at some point we want to have at the minimum have some recommended options to be considered later.
Certainly. Judd, did you want to weigh in? I see you're unmuted.
Sure. I did provide some of those letters that we've received from the FTA regarding questions related to the legitimacy or the designation of the council as the PO. A number of those were letters that were sent back in response to questions related to our MPO status. And the council did not send those letters, those original letters to the FTA. So we can certainly try to dig those up. I think a lot of the responses from the FTA that you saw cover a lot of the ground that were requested by the FTA to look at, but we can certainly try to find that. The veto letters that were provided to go back to the broader Met Council governance, which includes the different bills that were passed related to staggered terms, related to an elected Met Council that Governor Carlson vetoed, and then you saw the vetoes from both Governor Dayton and Governor Pawlenty. And so I don't know to what extent the committee wants to see what those what the legislature were looking at that time, but I will say that on the meeting, in the fourth meeting, we will also hear from the Citizens League, who've done a lot of work related to looking at governance models of the council, and they have done one specific to transit, and then one, or transit finance, another one related to council governance, that I think will be very informative to the to this group as well, and we'll get all that information sent around for folks to look at. To answer Connie's question is that I don't have a kind of a library of the different letters that have gone around, but we can certainly try to do some dig committee members.
The question, Mayor Kotz asked the question about what are we trying to figure out, and I've looked at a couple of these, and some of these responses, while the federal FTA and FHWA say that we meet the language of the law and we don't have to do anything, but they encourage and strongly encourage us to do that and recommend that we do that, but we don't have to. From what I understand, we're the maybe some of the council folks can verify, but we're the only state that's like this. And I don't know if that's a good thing. You know, we can say we're that much better than everybody else, that we're unique, or we can say that we're trailing. So is it, so that's kind of the, do we want to make a, you know, and the other, as a transportation professional, it seems like, and I don't want to make a case for changing or anything, but for us to consider, because it seems like every year, the topic, whenever you talk about transportation funding or transportation work in the city, this topic comes up of the council, and it seems to be a lack of a better term, like a thorn on our side. And so if there's an easy way to take care of that thorn and pull it out, that would, you know, that would be good. So I'm just trying to read between the different positions. That's why I was asking if there's a simple, you know, they politely recommend that we do it, but we don't have to. Well, we can stay the way it is and go on. So I think it's a heavy lift. So I mean, I know you're talking about adding a lot of other things to talk about, maybe that the council does, and just the governance part and the transit part, you know, and then there's other things too. So, but looking forward to what we do.
All right, thank you. And I mean, I know I'd like to stay as close as possible to the governor's mission. And while there's certainly other things to look at, I mean, transportation, of course, is a baseline for all kinds of things like economic development, housing, et cetera. But I think that we would be best served by narrowly focusing on the task at hand. So that's just my opinion, but anything else before we adjourn? All right, well, thank you all for your time. Nick and Amy and Tim, thank you for your presentations, and we'll see you all again in 2 weeks.
Yeah, thank you for your leadership, Chair Holberg.
All right, thank you. We're adjourned.